everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film my top 10 favorite reads of nonfiction from the year 2023. So these are the books that I love the most. They're not necessarily published in 2023. They're just books that I read in 2023. And the only qualification for them to be on this list is that they were the books that I got the most out of or enjoyed the most last year. And these are they're organized in order of when I read them in the year, not in order of like from 10th to 1st or anything like that. They're just in the order that I read them. And because I don't want to choose amongst them. These are all fantastic books and I recommend them all highly to you. So let's get to it. The very first book that I want to talk about is this one. This is Breathless, The Scientific Race to Defeat a Deadly Virus by David Quammen. And I read this, I think in January, very early on in the year. And this is Quammen's latest science nonfiction. I really like Quammen's writing. I think he writes about scientific topics very clearly. He tends to write about how viruses develop and are transferred between animals and humans. And this book is specifically about how scientists figured out what was going on with the coronavirus. So it takes all of the events that happened in the lead up to and the initial start of the COVID-19 pandemic and looks at various different scientists around the world, what they were studying at the time and how they all like pivoted really quickly to like map the genome of the virus and to figure out how to develop vaccines, and they figure out what was going on with this virus and try to figure out where it came from. So this does a lot of myth busting, this book. So I definitely highly recommend it if you like science books. And Quammen writes things in a way that's very highly engaging and propulsive to read. So that is the first book on my list. The second book on my list is another one that I read early on in the year. This is Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Criado-Perez. And this is a fantastic look at how all different kinds of things have been developed over the course of human history without looking at how those things impact women. Because studies to develop products or to figure out if something is safe for human use tend to be designed around men and only look at how those things impact men. And so this book goes through, very step-by-step way, goes through how that doesn't work for women, whether you're talking about car safety features like seatbelts and airbags, or whether you're talking about medical procedures like how we diagnose heart attacks or how we figure out how to correctly develop dosing for medications, that if you only do your research on male subjects, then you won't know how those things are going to impact female subjects. So I thought this was a really brilliant book. I learned a lot from this. It kind of blew my mind wide open in many different ways. The next book on my list is another sort of very related book that I read for the BookTube Prize, and that was Under the Skin by Linda Villarosa. And this is a book I borrowed it from the library, so I don't have that physical book here, but I will put a cover up. And this is a book about how racism is systemic and impacts Black people physically through their health. And so the author, who is a long-term journalist who has been studying and writing about health impacts of racism throughout her career, really takes a deep dive into this subject. So fascinating and so heartbreaking at the same time, about things like female mortality and infant mortality compared between Black females and white females. It looks at things like how long-term, over many years, impacts of racism impact things like heart health and high blood pressure and other types of like what's the word I want for diseases that you live with throughout your life? I can't think of the word right now, it's escaping me, but diseases that last your whole life, like diabetes and high blood pressure and things like that. I thought it was very enlightening and very eye-opening, and should be honestly required reading. And it was written in it wasn't written in like a histrionic way, but it really tugged at my emotions, and I appreciated that. I thought it led to the reader having a lot of empathy for the people who were impacted, because there's a lot of case studies that she describes where real individuals in the world were impacted by these horrible things, horrible impacts of systemic racism. The next book I would like to tell you about is one that I have raved about many times this year, and this is another science nonfiction, Bitch, on the Female of the Species by Lucy Cooke. This was a Book Naturalist book club read in the month of June for Pride Month, and this is a book that debunks the myth of the gender binary, and it goes through various different species, non-human species, and shows how nature is not divided into a binary when it comes to terms to sex. So, whether it's different species that change their sex during their lifetime and their life cycles, or it's, more than just male, female. And I thought this was just fascinating. It's written with a lot of humor. There's tons of great examples in here, fascinating creatures that you may not have ever heard of before, but then like really common species like frogs. How gender works with frogs is pretty fascinating. So yeah, if you are interested in the science behind gender and sex, then I would definitely recommend this one. And plus that, Lucy Cooke is just an extremely humorous author, and so I found this one a joy to read. The next book is another book that I do not currently have a copy. I read it from the library. It's another book that I read for the BookTube Prize, and that is His Name is George Floyd by Robert Samuels and Toluse Olorumipa. And this book was so good. I really love this book. Again, very heartbreaking in its content about George Floyd, who was the individual who was murdered by a police officer and sort of ignited the great increase in Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. And this is his story, but not just his story as like the day-to-day events that happen in his life, although it does have some of that information. What it is more of, to me, is a story of how the historical context of the country that George Floyd lived in impacted his life and led to the outcome that resulted in his death. So it goes back in history and talks about Floyd's ancestors and how they were slaves, and how that after slavery was ended, how his family was blocked from becoming landowners, and all the way up through to the present day, where school systems and criminal justice systems and healthcare systems, all these different systems, housing systems in the United States impacted his family and led to this young man having just such a narrow pathway that he was able to follow. And there is no, for folks that have so few choices as Floyd did, a few wrong choices lead to some bad places. And this book really demonstrates how that can happen to a person. And I just thought it was brilliant in its construction, and I really appreciated how Floyd's story was told. The next book is one that I read on my Kindle, and it is an ebook, and it is the only literary biography in the bunch, the only biography in the bunch, I believe. I don't read literary biography very often, but I did read The Last Englishman by Byron Rogers. And this is a literary biography of the author J.L. Carr, who was an English author who wrote one of my favorite books of all time, A Month in the Country. I buddy read this book with Sean the Book Maniac, and I thought it was fabulous. J.L. Carr was a very, very interesting person, and his biographer, Byron Rogers, does not write his story in sort of the traditional biography way, where it was like very linear, very dates and times and events oriented. This book it does go through Carr's life, but sort of takes it from like events or places that he lived and Carr's sort of strange way of looking at the world and organizes the information around those things. Carr came to writing late in his life. He was in the school system. He was a teacher and then a headmaster throughout his early part of his career, and then became an author or a published author after that. Formed his own publishing company. Like, he was just a very different person, and he had a very different way of looking at the world. And it's fabulous to read about his life. If you loved A Month in the Country, you must read this biography, The Last Englishman. If all biographies were written like this one, I think that many more people would read biography. The next book I'd like to tell you about is one that I, again, read for the BookTube Prize, and I'm so glad I did because this book is fabulous. This is Paradise Falls, the true story of an environmental catastrophe by Keith O'Brien. This is the story of Love Canal and the women, the mothers mostly, who fought to hold the companies who polluted, the companies and the governments that polluted and the governments that allowed it to happen to task for creating a hazardous place for them to live, and that was impacting their children in a medical way. So they rallied together and fought the companies and the government for the health and safety of their families. This book is so compulsively readable. I read this entire book in a 24-hour time period. I could not put it down. I know what happened at Love Canal in New York in the 70s, but I just had to know what was going to happen to these individuals. This is such a good story. It is, really one of the foundational stories that began real change in the United States in terms of how we set up environmental protections, how communities rallied together to fight back and to try to make their neighborhoods and their homes safer. This is just such a brilliantly written book. It's a very narrative nonfiction type of book, so it reads like a novel. If you are interested in environmental justice issues and you like a really interesting story well told, I can highly recommend Paradise Falls. Let's see, I'm running out of room over here. The next book is another book that kind of goes along with some of the other ones that I read earlier in the year. This is The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGhee. So this book takes some of the topics that were written about in the other nonfiction books I've highlighted and sort of synthesizes that information into chapters on various topics. And what I appreciated the most about this book was Heather McGhee's very positive way of looking at the world. Like, there are a lot of horrible things that are written about in this book, really terrible instances of racism and injustice and violence and terror that are perpetrated against people of color. But Heather McGhee takes those stories and shows us how people have either overcome those things or are working to combat those things, how people have been educated and have learned to be better because of some of these things. So every chapter and every case study that she depicts in here, she shows somebody sort of rising above it all. And that positive outlook and that hopefulness and that look towards the future and what could be done better kind of focus was so refreshing and so just made my heart glad to read. And I was so happy to have a book that talked about tough topics, but also showed positive ways forward and positive things that people could do and to make changes. Not just governments and not just like at the highest levels of decision making, but individuals who made choices and made decisions to make things better in their own lives or in their own neighborhoods or in their own towns. It's just such a good roadmap for how to live and to change things, I think, in the world. So yeah, awesome book. I mean, this book was on the National Book Award long list and has been highly praised and talked about, and there's a good reason for that. The next to last book on this list is one that you've heard on many people's lists this year. This is The Wager A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder by David Grann. This is the ultimate dad book. This is a book that you could probably envision yourself gifting to the man in your life that likes to read historical fiction or historical nonfiction. This is the story of the Wager, which was a sailing ship out of England in the 1700s, who was sent with a group of ships to round the tip of South America, the southern tip of South America, in pursuit of Spanish treasure ships. They take off on this journey in a ship that probably should not have been going anywhere. And of course, the squadron gets broken up, and this ship winds up shipwrecked on a little island in the southern, they make it around the point of South America, but they get shipwrecked on an island right in the vicinity of the tip of South America. And this is the story of what happens to those people as they journey to South America, what happens after they're shipwrecked, and then how a few of them escape and make it back to England, and what happens to them at that point and when they undergo a trial for mutiny. So this book is just an adventure on the high seas, as it says. It is filled with really interesting facts about what it was like to navigate by sea at this time period, what technologies were and weren't available to people, the deprivation that people suffered from having to travel on these ships. It would take months and years that they would be gone from home. And then when you were in a position of being shipwrecked on an island, like how is it that some people could survive this? Just an amazing story. And like, you just won't believe some of the stuff that is written about in here. I can highly recommend it. It is, again, another nonfiction book that's written like a novel. Grann really knows how to pace his writing to keep you motivated to keep reading. So it's another one that you'll have a hard time putting down. And then last, but certainly not least, is the only collection of essays on this list this year. And this is a book I read in November. This is Roxane Gay's newest book, Opinions, A Decade of Arguments, Criticism, and Minding Other People's Business. And as I've said many times, I love Roxane Gay's authorial voice. I love her wit. I love her sarcasm. I love her humor. I love how she takes really tough subjects in politics and culture and society, and like just absolutely tells it like it is. She skewers those things and shows the absurdity and talks about the hard things in a way that I think just really sends it home to you. And so this collection of essays, while not every single one of them was my favorite, there are some things in here. She tends to have some in her essay collections and some examples of writing about TV shows or music or other things that I don't necessarily understand the references. But like overall, her cultural criticism is spot on and so funny. And I just love her writing style. So there was no way that her book was not winding up on my top 10 best of the year list. So that's it. Those are the top 10 best nonfiction books that I read in 2023. Please tell me down below if you read and enjoyed any of these books, or if there was a book that I didn't mention that was your favorite that you'd like to tell me about. I would really love to hear about it. I hope you're all doing well and finding some great books to read. I will talk to you later.